Today we're going to be creating a REST API with Node and PostgreSQL. Before we start, we want to have the following three things installed on our machine. NodeJS, that's the JavaScript runtime we'll be using to write our code in. Postgres, that's our database. We're going to use PostgreSQL. And Postman, that's what we're going to use to make our get, our CRUD operation request, get, put, post, delete from the API that we're writing. So make sure you have those installed. They're different for every operating system for the most part, so I'm not going to go through the installation. Good to know JavaScript Basics, right? You want to have a foundation in writing some JavaScript code before you take this tutorial. That will be helpful. The API we'll be creating will be a fully functioning CRUD application, so we'll have the ability to create new students, find a specific student and get that information, or all the students. We'll be able to update specific parts of a student in the database, and we'll be able to delete students from a database. So to get started, go ahead and create a new folder called REST API and open it inside of your code editor. In my case, I'm using VS Code. First thing we want to do is open our terminal, so we can do that through terminal, new terminal, or we can do control backtick and that'll open it up for us. We want to initialize a project. So to do that, we can do npm init-y, hit enter. And that's going to create a package.json file for us. And now we're going to want to install two things. The first is Express. So to do that, we can say npm i --save Express. And Express is our framework we're going to use for our code. So let that install. And the next thing we're going to install is PG, and that's our Postgres kind of connector for our database. So npm i pg, and let that install. Now that those are installed, we're going to make our folder structure. And to start, it's going to be pretty simple. We're going to create a new folder, call it source src, hit enter. Inside of source, we're going to create a student folder. So we'll just call it student. So our REST API is going to be about students. Hit enter. And then outside of our source folder, we're going to create a new file and call it server.js. In our server.js file is where we're going to create our Express server. So we can say const express equals require express. Just like that. Now we can say const app equals express and const port equals 3000. And at the bottom, we're going to say app.listen. And we're going to listen to our port, which is 3000 here. So when we go to localhost 3000, this is where our stuff will be displayed. And we're going to create a callback function here. So we go to the port and we say console.log. And this is just for our purposes, so we know that our app is running. App listening on port, just like that. Save it. Okay, I'm using Prettier, so when I save, you're going to see that my lines move. That's okay. And we're going to run it down here in the terminal. So we can say node server.js and hit enter. And you're going to see app listening on port 3000. Now you're going to notice if you go to localhost 3000 on your browser, it's going to say cannot get slash. It's because we didn't give it something to listen to on the slash route. So for example, we can say app.get and we want to listen for the slash. So this is like our home route, localhost 3000 slash. And then we're going to have a request and response, req, res. So this is our callback function here. And when someone goes to this route, localhost 3000 slash, so when they hit that route, in our case, we typed it into the browser, right? And we hit enter. We want to send back something in the browser. So to do that, we can say res, so response.send, and we want to send hello world. Go ahead and save. Now this automatically won't work. We have to restart our server. So to do that, Control C, and then rerun node server.js, just like that. Now if we go to our localhost 3000 and refresh, we're going to see hello world. Now, I'm also assuming you've installed Postman, like we said about in the intro. So go ahead and open up Postman. And this is another way that we can ping that localhost 3000. We can reach out and let our server know, hey, we're hitting that endpoint. So when you open Postman, you're going to go to this plus sign, click on it, and you're going to see a GET request here. And in here, we can enter where we want to go to. So we're going to say localhost. And as you can see, I've already got it there. If you don't, go ahead and type it out. Localhost 3000, just like that. And if we click send, so this is another way of hitting that endpoint that's on our server, this slash here, without having to use our browser. So this is just another way to do it. So we hit send, and you're going to see it responds with hello world. So this is kind of how we're going to use Postman instead of a browser to do some of this work with the API. Now, before we get any further into routing and things like that, we want to go ahead and set up our PostgreSQL database. So I'm assuming you have Postgres installed on your computer. So we want to type in psql into our search bar, and we want to open up the SQL shell. Now, the first thing we need to do is log in. And in our case, we can most likely just hit enter. Enter for the database, enter for the port, enter for the username. If you put a password when you installed, in my case was test, and I hit enter, and that logs us into our shell. And if you just want to confirm you're connected, you can just say /con info and hit enter, and it'll probably say you're connected to database Postgres as user Postgres. And this is like the super user. We could create a role, but for this example, we're just going to stay as the super user for our database. So to see databases that already exist, we can say \L and hit enter. And you may have a list here of databases that exist. You may have one or two. In my case, there were a few that were generated, and then there's the test one that I made. And to create your own database, we can say create in capital letters here, database, and then in lowercase we're going to say student, because we're going to have students. We're going to have a students database, and hit enter. And you should see this create database message. That means it was successful. Now we can use \L to see our new database, students. The next thing we want to do is connect to our database so that we can create a table in there. So to do that, we can say \C, and then we can say students and hit enter, and it'll say you are now connected to database students as user Postgres. And instead of staying at the bottom of the screen here, it's a lot of info on it, so we can clear our screen with \! If you're on Windows, and then type CLS and hit enter. If you're not on Windows, it's probably clear. If you're on Windows, CLS, hit enter. Now that we're connected to our database, we can create our table for it. So to do that, we can say create table, and we're going to call our table students. So we're in our students database with our students table, and we're going to open a curly bracket and hit enter. Okay, and now is where we add our different fields. Our first field is going to be an ID, so we can say ID, and we're going to say serial. And what that's going to do is that's going to auto increment our ID every time we add a new student. So the first one will be 1, the ID will be 1, the second will be 2, 3, 4, right? We don't have to add an ID, it will do that for us. So ID serial, primary key, comma, and then we're going to hit enter. And now we're going to add our other characteristics of our student. So a student has an ID, probably has a name, and we're going to say varchar. And how long do we want our name to be? In our case, we're just going to use 255. They can have a very long name if they want, comma, enter. Email, same thing. Email varchar 255, comma, enter. We're going to have an age and date of birth yet. So we're going to have an age of type int, int, hit enter. And our last is a date of birth, DOB, and that is of type date. And then we can close our parenthesis, add a semicolon, and hit enter. And that will create our new table, our new students table in the database. Now to view the table we created and make sure it's there, we can use \DT display table and hit enter. And you're going to see that we have our students table in our database. Now that we have our database and table, we're going to create two students and insert them into our table. So to do that, we can say insert into, and we're going to use the students table. And what we want to insert is, for each student that we're putting in, is a name, email, age, and date of birth, DOB. And the reason we're not putting the ID in is because Postgres will automatically do that for us. That was part of the ID serial, the serial part of it. And we're gonna want to enter then our values. So I'm gonna hit enter and we're gonna say values. And now is when we're gonna put in our name, email, age, and date of birth for each student. So we're gonna have Joe, and the email is, we need to use single quotes here, Joe. The email is joe@gmail.com. Joe is 48, and date of birth is 1973 dash, so it's going to be year and then month and then day. So we'll say 0404. Okay, and that's our first user here. And notice that the age is not in quotes because it is int and it's not expecting the quotes. We can do a comma, and we want to put one more student in, and in our case it'll be Anna, comma, and it'll just be Anna@gmail.com. We'll say she is 23, and date of birth would be 2000-0101. Close it and add the semicolon. We're going to hit enter, and you're going to see this insert here, and you're going to see 02, and now we can check our table to see that these two values are in our table. So to check our users, we're going to query our database, and we're going to search for everything that's inside of our students table. So we can say select star means select everything, from, select all from, and we want our students table. So select all from students, semicolon, hit enter. And you're going to see our two students that we've inserted into our students table. Now that we have our database all set up, let's go ahead and go back to VS Code, and we want to create a new file in our main folder here, in our REST API folder, and we're going to call it database.db.js. And this is where we're going to have our database connection. So to connect to the database, we're going to say const pool equals require pg, and that's the name of our package we installed, .pool. And then underneath, we're going to create a pool object from the class. So we're going to say const pool equals new pool. So there's a pool class. And then we're going to need our user, host, database, password, and port. So user, and our user is just Postgres, one S. Host, we're going to say localhost. Database, and you have to remember what we called our database when we made it in the shell, and we called it students, right? Your password is going to be the password that you used when you installed Postgres. In my case, it was test. And the port we're going to be on is port 5432. And go ahead and save that. And what we want to do is we want to export this pool. This is how we're going to be making our queries. So down here, we're going to say module.exports equals pool. And go ahead and save it. The next thing we want to do is create our file structure within our student folder. So we're going to come over here and create three new files. The first one we're going to call queries.js, and this is where we'll store all of our SQL queries we're going to use against our database. We'll create another file, and we're going to call it routes.js. This is where we'll store our student routes. And we're going to create one more file. And we're going to call this one controller.js. And this is where we're going to store our business logic that's related to each route. So the first thing we want to do here is set up our routes file. So make sure you're in routes.js, and we're going to say const router equals require express. Okay, so we're using express's router. And then down here we're going to say const router equals router. All right, so now we have our router object. And we're going to create just one route for our router. So router.get. Going to use the slash root, and you're going to see that this looks the same as our slash root that's in our server.js. Over here, we're going to fix that in just a second. So for the moment, we'll say slash, and we're going to take the request and response, and we're going to say response.send using API route, just so we know that we're using this specific route that's in our student folder, right? This is our student route. And at the bottom here, we're going to say module.exports router. So what we're doing is we're creating router object, adding routes to it, and then we're going to export this router, and we're going to import this router over in our server.js file. So save this. And now we're going to go back to our server.js, and we're going to import this router from our student routes. So we're going to go back here. And at the top, underneath express, we're going to say const, and we'll call it student routes equals require, and we need the path to that JS file. So .source/student/routes, just like that. And now what we want to do underneath our app.get, we're going to say app.use, and we're going to create the route that leads to our student routes, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. So we're going to say /API/v1 version 1/students, or just student, students. And here we're going to say student routes. We're going to pass it our student routes. So app.use this path, and we want to use our student routes. So we're going to save this. And again, what this means, this is a little bit different. What this means is we're going to use this path /API v1 students. And once we go to that path and we hit just the /students, so just the end of it, we're going to send this using API route. So to test this, go ahead and restart your server if you haven't already. Control C to stop it, node./server.js to start it. And make sure it says app listening on port 3000. I'm going to go back to our browser and refresh on just the standard localhost, and you'll still see we have our hello world, because our server.js file, when we hit this just normal /endpoint, it sends hello world. Now if we go to this endpoint and just the initial /, which would just mean this, we're going to get, hopefully, we're going to get this using API route. So let's see, let's minimize this. And we're going to go localhost 3000 / all of that and hit enter. Oh, and we have an error here. We don't want 2 slashes, just 1. And you're going to see it says using API route. Now we can also do the same thing in Postman, which is where we're going to end up most of the time. So let's go back to Postman. And we still have our localhost 3000, right? If we send, we get hello world. And if we go to that /API/v1/students route and hit send, we're going to get our using API route message. Okay, so we're back in the code in our routes.js file. And instead of sending this using API route string back, this message, we want to send some students from our database back to the person requesting it. So they ping this, they hit this endpoint, this API v1 students endpoint that we have in routes here. And when we hit it, we want to query our database, get the JSON response with our students, and send it back to the person that's pinging it. So to do that, we're going to go to our controller.js file, and we want to create a getStudents function that we're going to export from this file. So we can say const getStudents, and what we're going to do is we're going to use this getStudents function over in our routes.js, and I'll show you that in just a second. But our getStudents function is going to take in a request and a response, and for now it's just going to console.log getting students. And what we want to do is we need to export this, so we can say module.exports, and we're going to export it as an object because there's going to be multiple of these functions. This is just the first one of quite a few. So we're going to say getStudents, and right now that's our only thing inside of our object we're exporting. So if we save this and we go back to our routes, we can then import this controller inside of our routes. So we can say const controller equals require / controller. And instead of putting this callback function here, we can put our getStudents function. So we can do this, and it's still a callback function, but we'll say controller dot, remember this is an object we're exporting and this is the method on it, so it's going to be controller dot get students, which takes in the request and response, right? But we can actually shorten this. We don't need the callback. Express knows, so we can just say controller dot get students, and it knows to call this function with the request and response passed as parameters. So when we go to this /route, this API /v1/student route, we call this controller.getStudents function, which is in our controller.js file. So now let's write the code to get the students from the database, right? So in our controller.js file, we're going to want to import our database or our pool from this db.js file. So to do that, we can say const pool equals require .. Okay, .. We need to go up another folder, and we find our db.js file. From here, then, we're going to get rid of console.log, and we're going to use this pool to query our database. So we can say pool.query, and this query function, query method, has two parameters. The first is our SQL statement, the statement we want to use to query the database. In our case, if you remember, we use select all from students to get all the students from our database, just like that. That's what we're going to want to do here. So inside of our string here, our query method, select all, which is the star, from students, just like that. So that's our method. And then it has a callback. It takes an error and a results. And if there's an error, so if there's something wrong with this query and it doesn't work, we're just going to throw an error. So if error, throw error. Then underneath that, if there is not an error and the response is okay, so res is for response, right? Not to be confused with results. So we can say response.status, res.status. If that's 200, and 200 is the okay status, so if it was a successful query, then we want to send back the JSON of all our students in the database, and that would be results.rows. So if the response status is okay, we're going to send back all our students from the database. One more thing before we test that query is we want to go back to server.js, and we want to add a middleware here by saying app.use express.json with parentheses, and that's just going to allow us to post and get JSON from our endpoints. Now that we have that, we can test our first route, right? So we have, it's our students route, and it's just the initial student. So to test it, we can go to Postman, and in Postman we already have get, and we have our route here, and all we need to do is click send, and you're going to see it's not going to work for me. It's because I forgot to restart my server. Make sure you restart your server. So here we go, restarting, app listening. Now we go to Postman, click send, And you're going to see it returns both of our students nicely formatted in JSON that are in our database. So we have Joe and Anna. And if we look here, Joe and Anna. So we've made our first route successfully. We've queried the database successfully in our API. Now you can also do that in your browser if you really want to. So you can go ahead and click enter, and you're going to get your JSON data back in your browser also by pinging localhost 3000 /API/v1/students in the browser. Also, thing to note that if you're getting JSON back and it looks like this and it looks kind of ugly, you can install a JSON formatter extension for your particular browser, and it'll format it nicely like this so it's more readable. And you noticed we haven't used our queries.js file yet. We're going to use that now. So we're going to cut out this select all from students, and we're going to put that in our queries.js file. So const get students equals, and we're going to put the query there. And then we're going to say module.exports equals, just like we did in the other file, we're going to have an object, and this is our get students query. So save that. Now we're going to come back to our controller, and we're just kind of separating out the queries from the business logic here. We could have left it in the controller, but as these queries get bigger and bigger, and let's suppose this REST API gets very big and you have a very long query, we don't want all that in our business logic. So we separate it in queries.js. So save it, go back to the controller. We're going to import that file in here. So const queries equals, and we're going to require, and we're going to go to the queries file, so /queries. And instead of our SQL statement here, we're going to put the variable name for our SQL statement, which is queries, the object, dot, and you're going to see it gives get students as autocomplete. So this is doing the same exact thing. Instead of putting the SQL statement directly in, we're doing queries.getStudents. Same thing. So this is our SQL statement, this is our callback function. And we probably want to test to make sure that this works, right? So to do that, we just restart our server, go back to Postman, send it, and you're going to see we still get our students back. So the next thing we want to be able to do is, instead of getting all students, we want to be able to get a specific student by ID. You're going to notice I'm back in my shell here. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. !CLS or clear if you're not in Windows, and we want to get a student by ID. So that query would look like this: select all from students where ID equals, and we type in the ID we want to find, right? In our case, it's 1 or 2. 1 was for Joe, 2 was for Anna, so ID equals 2, semicolon, enter. And you're going to see it only returns Anna. Now if we did ID equals 1 and enter, you're going to see it only returns Joe. Now we're going to take that logic and put it into our queries.js file. So this is our new query, right? Querying a student by ID. Const get student by ID equals select all from students where, and this part's just a little bit different, ID equals $1, and the $1 is our parameter, which we'll be passing in to this query. So $1 is our parameter. It's not like 1 or 2 that we did in the shell. This is kind of a variable name, kind of like this is a variable name for that. We're going to be able to pass a variable into this string. So save this, and let's go back to our controller.js file where we'll use it. Now we want to go to our routes file, and we need to create a new route for getting a student by ID. So we're in our students folder, routes.js file. We're going to say router.get, and instead of just slash, it's going to be slash and then a colon ID. And that means if we go /1/2, that's the route we'll take. So for example, instead of just /students, it'd be /students/1 or /2, depending on which student you want to find. So that's what the /:ID is. And the colon is only for the route thing, right? We don't use the colon here, we just say /2. We don't say /:2 here, only in the router portion here. Okay, and then we're gonna say controller.get student by ID, only one student, right? So this is gonna be our function, controller.get student by ID, and our route is /:ID, or when we type it in /ID. So save that. We're now gonna go back to our controller and we're gonna create that route, right? So const get students by ID takes in a request and response, and this is where we're now going to again query the database. But first we want to get that ID out of the URL or out of the parameters. So as I was saying, we can put in /1 or /2 here into Postman, and we want to get that ID out of that particular URL, out of the parameters of the request. So to do that, we can say const ID equals, and it's going to come in as a string, and so we need to parse that string into an integer. So we're going to say parse int, and we're going to parse the request dot params, there we go, dot ID, because we want the ID parameter that we established in our routes.js file right here. So we want to get that ID parameter that's part of our route or part of our URL, and we want to store it in ID. And now we're going to use that ID to query the database. So we can say pool.query, and we made our query, right? It's student queries or queries.get student by ID. So that's what we want here. Queries.get student by ID. So that's our SQL statement. And then we need to pass in the ID. And when we pass in different variables in, we need to use array brackets here, and we're going to say ID. If there were multiple, we'd add more things. But for now, it's just ID. And then we have our callback. So we have our query statement, our ID that we're going to pass into our query statement, and then our callback function. And our callback function always has an error and results, just like that. Whoa, too many. There we go. And inside of here is same deal, if error, throw error, if error, throw error. And underneath that, if the status is the 200 OK status, so response, not to be confused with results, response, request response, right? Response.status of 200. If the response is okay, then we want to send back the JSON results.rows, just like we did up in the first one, except this time it's only going to be the one student that we queried for. So we can save that. Make sure we're exporting get student by ID down in here, and in routes, that's where we're importing the object, right? So that's why we need to export it down here. Also in our queries, make sure we're exporting it. I think we forgot to do that. Get student by ID, comma, save it. Make sure you're saving all your files, right? And now we're gonna restart the server and we're gonna test it out in Postman. So restart, go over to Postman, and we're going to test it out. /1 should give us Joe. And you see we just get Joe back now. And if we change that 1 to a 2 and send it, you're gonna notice we just get back Anna, right? So now our get by ID route is getting specific students, right? And if we just do /students, we get back all of the students. Now this is the same pattern we're going to follow with the rest of our routes for adding a student, for updating a student, and for deleting a student. Okay, so let's get started with those. Let's go back to our routes.js file, and we're going to go ahead and add in our post route. So router dot, and this time we're sending data to our database, right? So get requests, we hit the send point and it queries the database and sends back information. Now for our post request, we're saying, hey, we want to give some information to the database to be stored. So we're going to say router.post, and we're going to use this slash, okay? And you're going to notice it's the same route as up here. That's okay. And we're going to create a controller function in just a second, and we're going to call it add student. So controller.addStudent will be our function that we'll create. It's not there yet. Let's go ahead and put this underneath this one. So we have our get slash, which gets all the students. And if we do a post request to slash, we can add a student. So we can have the same endpoint for get and post. So now let's go back to our controller.js file and create that student method, right? Add student method. So in here, we're going to say add student, just to make sure we remember to export it. And we're going to say const add student equals request response. All right, and when we send a request to our post endpoint, we're sending JSON along with that request because it needs to know what we want to store in the database, right? And we have to have some way to send that, and we send it through JSON. Kind of like we get JSON back when we do a GET request. When we send it, we're going to add this to the body of our request, and it's going to give that information to the endpoint, and that's going to be in our request. So we can get that information out of our request body, and to do that, we can use JavaScript Destructuring. So we're going to say const, and we have name, email, age, and date of birth, right? So we're going to have name, email, age, DOB equals request.body. So the request.body is an object, and the object has these different values in it, key values, and we want to get those out. And we're using destructuring here to get all of these out of the object, out of the body. So the first thing we want to do if we're adding a student, we want to check if that email already exists, right? Because we have a database full of students with emails. And if someone's already registered under an email, we don't want another student being able to be added with the same email. So the first thing we want to do before we just say, hey, let's take all these values and add them to the database, we want to make sure that the email is valid. And if the email is valid, which means it's not already in the database, then we can add the student. So our first check is actually going to be a query to check if this specific email exists in the database already. And we'll write the query for it in just a second, but let's go ahead and create the logic for it first. So down here we'll say check if email exists. Just leave that comment just so we remember. It's up to you if you want to add the comment or not. We can say pool.query, and this will be our SQL statement. We don't have it yet, but we can say queries, spelling queries dot check email exists. And then we want to send in something to this, right? We want to pass a variable. And again, we don't have this query statement written yet, but there'll be a variable where email equals, in our case, email, kind of like we did for ID up here. We want to pass in the email that they're sending in through the post request and make sure that it doesn't already exist. And then error and results, same as usual here. And then inside of here, if there is an email, it's going to return some rows. And if there's not going to be, it's just going to be like an empty array or undefined or null or something like that. So we can say if results dot rows dot length, which means there's an array and there's something in it. If there's an array of even one, right, that'll work. But results.rows.length of an array, an empty array, would be 0, which is falsy, and this if statement would not run. So if there is an email that already exists, there's going to be an array returned with 1 row. And if it already exists, we want to then send back something like email already taken. So response.send email already exists, just like that. Okay, we're gonna save this, and then we want to write the query, right? We didn't write the query to check if it exists yet. So let's head over to our queries file, const check email exists equals select, and we're gonna use an alias for student here so we can access different properties from that alias, and I'll show you what we mean here. So select s from students, s is the alias, s. So select s from students, s, the alias, where, and here's where we get the property of that alias. So s.email equals, and again we're going to use $1 for the variable that we're passing into this query. So we're s.email equals $1. Make sure we export this or it won't work. Check email exists. Just like that. Make sure you save. And the variable we're passing in is right here. It's the email that we got from the destructuring of the request body. And I'll show you what that body looks like now as we try it out. So make sure we restart our server. And let's head over to Postman. And in Postman, make sure you change from a get to a post request, because now we're giving information to the endpoint to store in the database. So post, the route is just the slash, right? The API student slash. And we need to send some data. So you're probably in params here. Make sure you go over to body, click on raw, and this is raw JSON that we're sending. And go ahead and type this out if you haven't already. We're going to use a person's email that we already know exists, because that's the logic we have written so far. So we know Joe exists. He's got an email, age, date of birth, and we're sending a post request. So this is the data. So we're hitting this endpoint and we're saying, hey, take this data and try and store it in the database. And we already have the logic for if the email is already existing, then we want to send back, hey, that email is already taken. And in our case, we already know this email exists. That's why we're sending it. So let's give it a go, send. So if you're like me and you just click send and it didn't work, make sure you restart your server and you change this text to JSON. That will make a difference because we're sending JSON, right? Notice the syntax highlighting here. Before we're sending text, we actually want to make sure we're sending JSON. That's going to make a big difference. So cancel it, restart your server, and now we're going to send this information, and we should get a response of email already taken. There we go. So email already exists. We know that this email won't work. We can try again. We're going to get the same thing. Email already exists. So we know that we need to try a different email, right? So let's go write the logic for what happens if the email is not taken. We now have the email validation here. So now let's go ahead and say if the email doesn't exist and we can add the student, we need to write the logic for that. So add student to database, and we can say pool.query. Notice how this is nested inside of this one, right? You want to check the email first, and if it's not there, then we want to add the student to the database. So we're going to query student, or queries dot, and add student. And we haven't made this yet, but we will write the query for this in just a minute. And we want to take in all 4 of these variables up here. So name, email, age, DOB. And then we want to have our callback function, just as we always do. So comma, and this is the same deal, error and results. And same thing, if error, we're going to throw an error. So if error, throw error. Underneath that, if there's not an error, then we want to add a student to the database. So the query is what's doing the adding of the student, right? So if the student is created successfully, that's going to give a 201 status code, which means it's created. The student has been created. So we can say res for response, which is up here, right? Not results, response dot status. If the status is 201, which means a student has been created successfully, we want to send a message saying student created successfully. Okay, and if we want to, just for our purposes, we can also log the fact in here that the student has been created if we wanted to. So student created. I'm going to leave it out for now, but if you want to write a log just so you can see it in here, you can do that. But we do need the response. If it's 201, then we want to send that the student has been created successfully. So let's save this and let's go test it out. Again, ignore all the formatting here. When I save prettier, just goes ahead and formats it for me. Just realized we forgot to write our query for add student. So before we can test it, we need to write our queries.addStudent query. So head over to queries.js. And we're going to say const add student. And before we write it, let's go ahead and make sure we put it down here so we don't forget to export it. Equals, and we're going to say, instead of select this time, we're going to insert. So it's going to be like be like this: insert into students, their students table, and our values are going to be name, email, age, and date of birth, values, and this is where we're going to put our values. In our case, we're passing variables in, so it's just $1. After $1, $2 is our second variable, $3, and $4, just like that. And go ahead and close it, close the quotes, semicolon. So insert into students, name, email, age, date of birth, and the values are 4 parameters or 4 arguments that we're passing into this string. So save this, and we can then go over to our controller and see, just to make sure that we're passing in those 4 arguments. So name is that $1, right? That's our first variable. $2 is our second argument, which is email. $3 is age, and $4 is date of birth. Save it, restart your server if you haven't already. Let's head over to Postman and give it a try. We already know if we use joe@gmail.com, that email already exists, so we're going to get this email already exists response, and no student will be created. Now let's try an email that doesn't exist, right? So let's create a new student, Frank at gmail.com. Let's make him 34, and we don't need this time here. We'll just do the date like this, and we'll say he was born in 83. If you've been keeping track of the ages and the dates they were born, they're not exactly right. It's just an example, right? So we have our post request, sending our raw JSON, email that does not exist, and so we should get down here our student created successfully response. So let's give it a go. Send. Could not send request, right? So sometimes this happens, and it's good to go back and check. And so I did want to leave one of these errors in here as an example of this. Let's see what's wrong. Client was passed a null or undefined query, perhaps. Oh wait, cannot set headers after they are sent to client. Okay, so go ahead and restart your server. It's just because we tried to do 2 at once. So restart. And now we're going to send Frank. So sometimes you got to read up through the error, right, to make sure and see what's wrong. And this is just one example I wanted to leave in of myself getting an error to kind of show you this. So we scroll up into the most recent error, and it's saying cannot set headers after they are sent. So we already sent a response. So in our case, we just want to restart our server, and then we can go and try this again. Click send, and you're going to see it says student created successfully. Well, how can we prove that, right? Well, we can go over here and we can get all students. So now this body's here, but we're not actually sending it because we're making a GET request, not a POST. And let's get all students. And let's see. You can see we have Joe, Anna, and we've added Frank here. We've also added a third Joe at some point along the line accidentally. If you've done that like me, we'll get rid of him in a second when we do delete. But for now, looks like we have 2 Joes, an Anna, and a Frank. And just to confirm that, we can go here into our shell, select all from students. Okay, and we see we have everyone here. And before we go to delete request, let's go ahead and just write a delete query in here to delete this extra Joe from the table. We don't want 2 Joes in our table. So we can say delete from students, the students table, where, and we can just delete him by ID. So ID equals 3, ID equals 3. If you don't have the extra Joe, that's okay. If you do, this is the query we can write to delete it. And you'll notice it says delete 1. So then if we go back and we select all from students, I'm just hitting the up arrow here to get my previous commands I typed into the shell. So if you didn't know that, now you do. Just click up to find your previous commands you've typed and hit enter. And you're going to see that now we just have Joe, Anna, and Frank. And we can go to Postman and send it just to confirm that we've deleted the extra Joe. So we've covered get and post routes. Now we want to cover the delete route. So what happens if we want to delete a student from our database, our students table? Well, we need a route for that, so we can say router.delete And we can use this slash colon ID route again. And we're going to say controller dot, we'll say remove student. Could also say delete student there, it's up to you. So you're going to notice we have this delete route. It's on the same route as the get, but again, that's okay as long as it's a different kind of request, right? So we have a get post on this slash route, and when we have a get and delete on this slash ID route, and that's okay as long as these two have the same route twice, as long as these two are different methods. So save that, and let's head over to our controller, and we're going to create this remove student function. So let's go ahead and create our remove student function, and down here in the exports, let's just go ahead and add it, remove student. And then we're going to add our function here. So const remove student, again, takes in the request response, just like the other ones. And to remove a student, we're going to look for the student ID and remove them by ID. So we've seen something similar up here in getStudentById. We want to get this ID from the URL or from the parameters of the request. In our case, it'll be, we'll select a student here, like 1, 2, or 3, or 4 in our case, and that's how we'll know which student to delete. So we want to get the ID out of the request parameters. So we can say const ID equals, remember the ID comes in as a string, so we need to parse it, parse int request.params.id. And that's that ID variable that's going to be coming in on the route, or that we're adding to the route, right? So make sure we parse it and we store the ID here. And then we want to check, so if a student isn't in the database, like if we send an ID that's not in the database, then we want to send a response saying student doesn't exist. Could not delete student, they do not exist. And if they ID does exist, then we want to delete it and say student deleted, or student with ID is deleted. So the first thing we need to do is check to make sure that the student exists in the database. If not, we want to send student not found. So to do that, we can say pool.query, and we're going to need to create the query, right? Can't forget to do that like last time. My fault. Queries dot, we're going to say remove student, and then we're going to pass in the ID that's here. That's our parameter that's going to be in this remove student query. We pass into it error results, and we want to say if there are results that are returned, then a student is found. If there are results if the results are empty or returns null or undefined, then there is no student found, which means we want to send back no student exists. So let's create a variable to make that logic a little easier to understand. We'll say const no student found equals, if there are not results dot rows dot length. So if there are no results, if the length of the results is 0, then there is no student found, and we want to return a response of, hey, there's no student found, could not delete the student. So response dot send student does not exist in the database, could not remove. And actually we can just go with student does not exist in the database. That'll be fine. And we want an if statement around it. If no student found. If no student found, then we send student does not exist in the database. Make sure that we export this here. We did remove student. And now we want to write the query for queries.remove student, right? And so to do that, let's go over to queries.js, and we'll say const remove student. Don't forget to add it down here. remove student. And we're going to say delete from students. The students is the table, right? Where, we'll capitalize where, ID equals $1. Similar to up here, we're searching for the ID of whatever ID they pass into this query statement. In our case, if we type in 1, 2, or 4, and we're going to delete that row from the students table. So save this. In controller, we're set to try out an ID that does not exist so we can get this response, and then we'll write the logic to actually delete the student. So make sure you restart your server if you haven't already. And then we're going to head over to Postman. And in Postman, make sure you change the type of request to delete. And so when we hit the endpoint with a delete request, and we're going to make sure we have an ID that doesn't already exist, in our case 9, because we have 1, 2, and 4 that do exist, but we wrote the logic for an ID that does not exist. So 9, and it should send back something like student does not exist, or whatever we wrote over here. Student does not exist in the database. Perfect. So send it. And we get the response of student does not exist in the database, which is perfect. Now we want to write the logic for actually deleting the student if they do exist. So a bit of faulty logic on my part. We actually want to get student by ID first to make sure that the student exists. We don't want to use the remove query. We want to use the get student by ID query that we already have. So we check if the student exists by getting them by ID. If they do not exist, still the same response here. Student does not exist in the database. If they do exist, we want to delete the student, right? So underneath the if statement, then we use our delete query that we wrote. So queries dot remove student. So again, the first one is we check to make sure the student exists by getting the student by ID. And if they do exist, we want to remove the student with the query that we wrote. So again, we pass in the ID to remove the student, error results, and we want to say if error, throw error, if error, throw error. If the result that comes back from this is 200, which means it's okay, the student has been removed, so we want to send a response. Sorry, if the response is 200, so response.status 200, right? Don't get response and results mixed up. Response is up here, results is here. Response status is 200. Then we want to send back student removed successfully. So we check if the student exists by ID. If they do, we remove the student. If they do not, we send back does not exist in the database. So go ahead and save and restart your server and head over to Postman. All right, and just to confirm your student IDs, go ahead and query in your shell just to make sure. Mine are 1, 2, and 5 for Joe, Anna, and Frank. Now I want to delete one of these, right? And you want to delete one of the IDs that you have. So I want to head over to delete. We want to delete request to this endpoint, and I'm going to delete student. Again, if I try 9, it'll say student doesn't exist. So let's try 5 because we know Frank has the ID of 5, right? And if we send it, we see student removed successfully. Now how can we prove that, right? Well, we can go back to a get request and get all students. And we're going to see just 1 and 2 are the only students that exist, Joe and Anna. Frank has been removed. And you can confirm that in the shell. If we select all students, we see we just have Joe and Anna. So the last route we need to write is our put request, which means we're going to update a student that already exists. So we can go here and say router.put. And again, we're going to use that /:ID because we're going to use the ID passed in the URL as a parameter to get the student and update the student. And controller dot update student, just like that. So update controller dot update student will be our function, and we're hitting this /ID again. Again, as long as these methods are different, it's okay to have the same endpoint. Save it, and let's head over to controller.js. In our controller.js file, we want to create our update student function. Update student. Again, takes in request response. And the first thing we want to do is get the ID out of the URL, or out of the parameters like we did for the previous functions. So to do that, const ID equals parseInt request.params.id, just like that. And this time we're going to say we can only update the name of a student. So we're going to also, in the update request, when someone passes it in, like we did for post, when we did post, we passed in some JSON along with the post request. So we said, hey, we're going to hit this endpoint and we're going to send some JSON in along as the body of information to post, to give to the database, to store in the database. In our case, this time we're going to send some JSON with just the name. So we're going to send some JSON of a name to update a specific user that already exists in the database. So we have the ID that we want to update, and then we want to get the name that they're sending in the body out of the body and into our code. So we can say const, again with the destructuring name, because it's going to come in as part of the body, equals request.body. And that gets the name out of the body that we want to update. And now we need to check if the student exists, right? So when we're updating a student, we want to go in there, and if the student ID exists, if the student exists, then we want to continue. If not, we want to return with no users, no student found, right, in the database with this ID or something like that. So we can say pool.query, and we've already written this query statement, right? Same one as up here. Queries.getStudentById. Pass in the ID. Okay, this should be starting to see the patterns. Error results. And same deal as above, const no student found. Same deal. We can actually copy this, paste it down here. If no student found, send, let's see, student does not exist in the database. We'll send the same error. That works. Now if the student does exist, right, we want to then update the student. So underneath our if statement, so if they do exist, we want to update the student. So pool.query, we haven't written this query yet, but we will soon. Queries.update student. And in this case, we're going to pass in the name because we want to update the name of the student. And then we're going to say error results, just like always. And so the name is what gets passed to our query, which is then how it updates the name. If error, throw error, just like always. And if there's not an error, if the status that comes back from the query update is 200, if the response status is 200, so response.status 200, which means it's okay, a student was updated successfully, .send. We're going to just send the message student updated successfully, just like that. And then we can save this, and let's go ahead and restart our server. And as you can see, we got an error here, so let's check our error. Requires a callback function. Okay, so we need to make sure that we add this here. Always good to check your errors if you get them. So update student needs to go here. And we also need to add update student in our query. So let's go ahead and do that. We forgot to do that. So over in our queries.js file, we need an update student variable and query string. So let's add update student here before we forget. And then we're going to say const update student equals, and we're going to say update, just like it sounds, right? Updates the students table. We're going to set name equals $1, right? So the variable that we pass in. So update the students table, and we're going to set the name to 1. And that's going to be, we have to pick the row, right? So we can't just say set name to 1. We have to say where ID is. ID equals the second variable we pass in. So update the students table, and we're going to set the name to the first thing we pass in, where the ID equals the ID we pass in. So save that, and let's head back to controller because I don't think we passed ID in here. So here's ID. We need to pass it in here. So our first variable is name that goes into our query, and the second variable is ID that goes into our query. Just to, again, to confirm, update students, set name equals the first one name, where ID equals the second variable, which is ID. So now save it all. Make sure you save everything. Go down, restart the server, and head over to Postman. Okay, so we're over in Postman. We want to make sure we change our request type to put so that we're updating something. And let's test both ideas, right? So our first one is an ID that doesn't exist should return a response of student doesn't exist, right? So let's try that, send it. We're gonna try and let's pick a different name just in case it would work. It won't, but let's just pick a different name. So in our case, Elsa, since we already have Anna in the database. And we're gonna click send. And you're gonna see student does not exist in the database. That's okay. Let's go ahead and our server stopped, so restart it. Head back to Postman, and now we're gonna pick a student that does already exist in the database. And we already know that Anna is there, and I believe she's the first one, but let's make a get just to confirm. Nope, Joe's the first one. So we wanna use the ID 2 and replace Anna with Elsa. So to do that, student/2 is the ID, and the new name that we want the student with the ID of 2 to be is Elsa. So, and make sure we have a put request, right, or it won't work. Send it. And you're gonna see student updated successfully. We confirm that 2 places. We can confirm it by either getting just student 2, right, which will show Elsa as the new name, or we could get all students. Again, it'll show Elsa. Or we could go over to the shell and select all from students. So her email is still anna@gmail.com and her name's Elsa, so we might want to write some additional things in our code to update that, but that would be for a later video for you to try on your own. So that's it for this video. You've successfully written your first REST API using Node and PostgreSQL. It had all the features of a fully functioning CRUD application, right? You can create a student, you can get the students, you can update students, and you can delete a student. So you've successfully created your first REST API. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.